The traitor was still smiling when Damon walked in. His name was Renzo, and for 9 years he had counted Ricci money and skimmed a thumbnail's width off the top of every transaction, and he had convinced himself that a thumbnail was too small to notice. He was sitting in a leather chair in a back office above the marina, 2 of Damon's men flanking him, and he was smiling because he still believed this was a conversation. Damon did not sit. He never sat for these. He walked to the window and looked out at the black water and the white boats, and did not raise his voice, because the men who needed to raise their voices were men who were not sure they'd be obeyed. 9 years, Damon said. I want you to understand that I'm not angry about the money. Boss, the money is nothing. A rounding error. He turned. His eyes were the flat gray of a sea before weather. I'm here because you decided I wouldn't notice. That's the insult, not the theft. The arithmetic of it, the assumption that my attention has a flaw you could slip beneath. He came closer, unhurried, and Renzo's smile finally began to die. There is no flaw. That's the thing men like you never believe until it's too late. I see the thumbnail. I've always seen the thumbnail. He nodded once, a movement so small it was almost nothing, and his men lifted Renzo out of the chair, and Damon was already looking back at the water before the door closed. He did not watch. He never watched. Watching was for men who needed the reassurance, and Damon Ricci had not needed reassurance about anything in 11 years. Since the afternoon, he'd sat in the back seat of an idling car and watched his father die on the oil-stained concrete of a parking garage, and learned the only lesson that had ever mattered. The man who feels the least wins. He had felt almost nothing for a decade. It was efficient. It was armor. It had made him the most feared man in the state of Florida. He straightened his cuffs, checked his watch, and turned toward the door, because he had a partner gathering at Velvet in 90 minutes, and his assistant was waiting downstairs with the files, and there was no reason in the world for his pulse to change at the thought of that. There was no reason, and it changed anyway. It always did. That was the one variable Damon Ricci had never learned to control. Rewind to that morning. Bella Moreno had known something was coming for 3 days, because the coffee order was wrong. Not her coffee, the Ferraro delegations. Every Tuesday for a month, a Ferraro courier had come by the Brickell office to drop paperwork, and every Tuesday he'd taken a cortado, no sugar, and made a joke about Miami heat. This Tuesday, a different man came. He took a black coffee, no joke, and his eyes moved over the office in the specific, unhurried way that Bella had learned, over 3 years, meant a man was building a map. Exits, cameras, who sat where, the rhythm of the room. Bella filed the paperwork, smiled, said the thing about the heat herself when he didn't, and the moment he left, she made a note in the small private notebook she kept in her bottom drawer, the one nobody knew about, the one where she'd been quietly cataloging the pattern of Damon Ricci's world for 3 years, not out of ambition, but out of survival, because a woman does not last 3 years at the center of a war by being decorative. That was the thing none of them understood about her, least of all Damon. They thought she'd survived because she was harmless. She'd survived because she paid attention, and she'd learned very young that the safest place in any dangerous room is the place no one bothers to watch. She had made herself into that place on purpose. The plain clothes helped, though she'd never told Damon it was mutual, that his rule about buttoned collars and charcoal suited her fine, because invisibility was a skill, and she'd been sharpening hers since long before she met him. A woman who is looked at is a woman who is tracked. A woman who is overlooked can move through a burning house and out the other side, and no one will ever be able to say which room she was in. So when the matte black box arrived that afternoon with a card in Damon's sharp handwriting, "Tonight is formal. Wear this." The first thing Bella felt was not excitement. It was alarm, because the dress inside was emerald silk, cut to be seen, and every instinct she'd spent 3 years building went cold and quiet at once. He's making me visible, she thought. Tonight of all nights, with Ferraro men mapping the office. Why would he do that? He never does that. He's the one who taught me to disappear. She turned the card over, and on the back, in handwriting that was not Damon's older, more elegant, pressed hard into the cardstock was a single line. "Let them see you, dear. It's time he stopped being a coward. I.R." Bella sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. I.R. Isabella Ricci, Damon's mother, 71 years old, always described in the same 3 words: retired, widowed, harmless, and Bella had believed exactly none of those 3 words for about 2 years now, ever since she'd noticed that the biggest decisions in the family seemed to happen in the 40 minutes after Damon had Sunday lunch with his mother, and never before. Damon hadn't chosen this dress. His mother had, and his mother had chosen it as a move, a piece pushed across a board, meant to force her son into the open square he'd been refusing to occupy. Bella understood then that she was not the target of tonight. She was the bait, and she understood too that she had a choice: refuse to play, stay invisible, stay safe, or wear the dress and find out what the old woman knew that she didn't. She thought about the courier with the wrong coffee order. She thought about the map being drawn around a soft place in Damon's armor, and she thought with the clear, cold practicality that had kept her alive, if someone is coming for him through me, then I need to stop hiding and start watching from the front of the room where I can see them come. She put on the dress, not because a man told her to, because she'd done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said tonight, be seen. Damon returned to the penthouse with marina salt still on his coat, and the calm of a man who had just solved a problem permanently, and he was reaching for the file on the counter when the bathroom door opened behind him. He turned, and 11 years of armor developed a hairline fracture he could hear. Bella stood in emerald silk, and Damon Ricci, who had, 90 minutes earlier, ended a man's 9 years of life without changing his heart rate, forgot the name of the partner he was meant to meet. He forgot the marina. He forgot, briefly, the lesson of the parking garage, which was the one thing he had never once forgotten in a decade. This came in the box, Bella said, watching his face with an attention he mistook for nervousness. It was not nervousness. She was reading him the dilated pupils, the half-second his jaw took to remember it had a job, the way his weight shifted toward her before his discipline pulled it back. In 3 years, she had catalogued every micro-expression this man had, and she had never once seen this one, and it told her everything the old woman had bet on was true. I can change, she said. Testing. If it's not appropriate. No, it came out rough. He heard it come out rough, and the horror of that of a crack in his voice steadied him faster than anything. He buried it. It's fine. We're late. It's fine, he said, the way a man says he's fine while bleeding out. Bella noted the lie and filed it. She also noted, because she noticed everything, that he had not asked who sent the dress, which meant he assumed he had, which meant his mother had ordered it in his name, which meant Bella now knew something Damon didn't. She kept that. Information you don't reveal is the only kind that stays yours. Damon, she said, as he turned for the elevator. The Ferraro courier changed on Tuesday. New man. He mapped the office. Damon stopped. He turned back, and for a moment the thing in his eyes was not the boss and not the man who wanted her. It was pure predator, the part of him that had kept them both alive. You're certain? I'm certain. Black coffee. No joke about the heat. And he counted the cameras. She held his gaze, steady. I didn't want to say it in an email. I don't trust the email. Something moved across Damon's face that she had also never seen. Not desire, not control, respect. The specific, startled respect of a man realizing the person he'd spent 3 years underestimating had been quietly guarding his flank the entire time. You've been watching them, he said slowly. I've been watching everyone, Bella said. It's why I'm not dead, sir. The sir was almost a joke. Almost. Damon looked at her in the emerald dress with her chin level and her eyes clear and understood, 11 years too late for his own comfort, that the woman he'd kept plain to keep hidden had never needed his protection to survive. She'd been surviving him and everyone around him through sheer intelligence since the day she walked in. The realization did not make him want her less. It made the fracture spread. Stay beside me tonight, he said. It was not the order it sounded like. It was almost a request. If you see the courier's face in that room, you touch my sleeve. You don't speak. Just touch my sleeve, and I'll handle it. And if I see something you don't, a pause, then I'll trust that you saw it, Damon said. And it cost him something to say, because trust was a crack too, and he'd spent a decade sealing every one. Come, we're late. They rode down in silence. In the mirrored elevator, he watched her reflection and told himself it was tactical. It was not tactical. Bella watched his reflection, watching hers, and let him think she hadn't noticed, and filed that too. Velvet's top floor was 200 people, and purple light pouring down like liquid over glass and gold, and Bella walked out of the private elevator and felt the room turn toward her like sunflowers. And for one disorienting second, the old panic rose. They're looking. They're tracking. You're visible. You're exposed. And then she did the thing 3 years had trained her to do. She used it. Because a woman everyone is looking at can look back at all of them. From the front of the room, in the full purple glare, Bella Moreno swept the crowd with the same unhurried mapping the courier had used on the office, and she catalogued them. The shipping magnate deciding she was available, the senator's son murmuring, the bartenders, the exits, the 2 men near the service corridor who were too still, and the tall, easy, smiling man detaching himself from the far wall, moving toward her with a drink he wasn't drinking, and something about the way he moved made every hair on Bella's arms stand up. It wasn't the way a man moved toward a woman he wanted. There was no want in it. It was the way the courier had moved through the office, a map with legs. He wasn't crossing the room toward her. He was closing a distance, the way you close a distance on a target. And his eyes had already flicked once fast, professional past her shoulder to Damon. Bella's blood went to ice water. He's not looking at me. He's using me to get a clean line to Damon. She did not scream. She did not run. Running is how the overlooked become the noticed, become the dead. She did the one thing she'd promised. She turned, found Damon 12 feet away with a tumbler in his hand, and she moved toward him. And as she moved, she reached out and closed her fingers around his sleeve. But Damon had already seen her face. He'd been watching her the way he'd watched her in the elevator, unable not to, and he'd seen the exact moment the color left her cheeks, seen her eyes snap to a fixed point and go flat and cold. And Damon Ricci had survived 11 years by knowing that a woman does not look like that at a party unless she is looking at death. He was moving before she reached him. He met her halfway. Her hand hit his sleeve and he was already turning her, already lifting the black coat from his own shoulders, already reading the trajectory of her stare back to its source. And there was Luca Ferraro, mid-step, 12 feet out, his hand not yet inside his jacket but about to be, and every piece slammed into place inside Damon at once, with a violence that whited out the edges of the room. He settled the coat over Bella's bare shoulders. The lining was warm from his body. He pulled her in against his chest, turning her spine to the threat and his own back to the gun, and he lifted his head and looked at Luca Ferraro across 12 feet of purple light. And every man in that room who had been deciding Bella Moreno was available remembered, all at once, exactly whose city they were standing in. Luca Ferraro stopped walking. His hand came back out of his jacket, empty, because a clean shot had just become a suicide, because the target had wrapped himself around the bait and turned a simple kill into a war he'd been paid to avoid. Damon's voice, when it came, was for Bella alone, and it was not calm. Every ounce of 11 years of control had gone into keeping it quiet, and there had been nothing left over to keep it cold. "No one," he said, "looks at what's mine." The word landed in the center of Bella's chest like a struck bell. Mine. And even in the ice water of the moment, even watching the killer over Damon's shoulder, some 3 years buried part of her heard it and broke open. Corridor, she breathed against his collar, because there was work to do and she was, above all, a woman who did the work. 2 more of them by the service door. Left side. Don't go left. Damon went still for a quarter second, not with fear, with something almost like awe. She's counting them. In the middle of this, she's counting them. Bella. I know. I have the exits. The kitchen stairs are clear. I checked when we came in. Her voice was shaking and precise at the same time, and it was the most extraordinary thing he had ever heard. Walk me to the kitchen. Slow. Like we're leaving a boring party. Don't run. Running is how they know. And Damon Ricci, the most feared man in Florida, who took orders from no one, put his arm around his assistant's waist and let her walk him out of a kill zone. What happened in the next 4 seconds, Bella would spend the rest of her life reassembling. They moved toward the kitchen at exactly the pace of 2 bored people leaving early. Damon's men were already peeling off the walls, converging, and Luca Ferraro, watching his elegant plan walk calmly away from him, made the professional's last calculation that a shot now, even a bad one, was better than a debrief that began with the word failed. Bella felt it before she heard it. She'd been watching the reflection in the chrome of the bar the whole time, The way she watched everything. And she saw Ferraro's shoulder drop and his hand move, and she shoved Damon sideways with everything she had, not away from herself, toward the pillar half a second before the flat crack cut under the base, and the mirror where his head had been came apart into a silver waterfall. Screaming, far away, Damon's men closing like a fist. And Damon, who had been shoved to safety by a woman in an emerald dress, got exactly one look at Bella's face, white, fierce, absolutely present, and understood that she had just saved his life with the same skills she'd used to save her own for 3 years, and that he had spent all that time thinking he was the one protecting her. Then he had her, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other drawing something dark from beneath his jacket, and he walked her backward through the swinging kitchen doors into the clatter and steam, down the stairs she'd promised were clear, into a narrow service corridor under a single caged bulb, where the chaos dropped to a muffled roar and a steel door slammed the world away. And there, in the sudden dark, Bella finally started to shake. "You pushed me toward the pillar," Damon said. His voice was not quite steady either. "Not away, toward cover. You knew the geometry." "I always know the geometry." Her teeth were chattering now that it was over. "I know every room I stand in. It's the only thing that's ever kept me alive." He finished it for her. He was staring at her like a man seeing a painting he'd walked past 1,000 times and never once looked at. 3 years, and I thought I was keeping you safe." "You were," she swallowed. "We were keeping each other safe. You just never noticed I was doing it back." For a moment, the untouchable man had nothing at all. No armor, no distance, no clean, cold arithmetic. Just a corridor and a girl in emerald and the truth he'd carried like a stone since the day she'd walked in. "I made you a target," he said, low. "Not the dress. Me. They spent months looking for the one crack in the wall, and it was you, because I could never once make myself stop caring whether you lived. I hid it so well I nearly hid it from myself. And it still wasn't well enough. They found you anyway." His jaw worked. "The thing I did to keep you safe, keeping you plain, keeping you at arm's length, keeping you a secret, it's the exact thing that nearly got you killed tonight. If they'd known you mattered to me openly, they'd have known I'd protect you like this. Instead, they thought you were soft, unguarded, easy. They thought I was decorative," Bella said. "Everyone always does." Something hardened in her wet eyes. It's usually the last mistake they make. Damon looked at her, really looked. The way he'd refused to for 3 years, and the fracture became a fault line, and the whole armored edifice came down. "You made me think I was invisible to you," Bella said. And now her voice broke properly. 3 years of it. "I built a wall too, Damon. I told myself I didn't care that the great Damon Ricci looked straight through me. It was easier to be safe than to be seen. But God, I got so tired of being safe. You were never invisible." He reached out, stopped, the old reflex, the welded door, and then, for the first time in 3 years, let himself finish the motion. His hand came up and touched her face, careful, like she might dissolve. "You were the only thing I could ever see. That was the whole problem. I looked at you so much I had to build rules to survive it. Wanting is the crack, Bella. Wanting is how they killed my father. I watched it happen. I swore I'd never hand anyone that kind of power over me again." His thumb moved along her cheekbone. "And then you walked into my office and made me a liar, the same afternoon." "Then stop lying." She was gripping his shirt now, the coat sliding off one shoulder. "They already know. It's already dangerous. I'd rather have the truth and the danger than 3 more years of you pretending you can't see me." Damon looked at her the way a man looks at the one door he swore he'd never open. Then he opened it. He kissed her the way he did everything completely, like the world could end, like he'd been holding his breath for 11 years and had finally been given permission to let it go. Bella rose into him, both hands fisting in his shirt, and every rule came down at once, and neither of them mourned a single one. When they broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers, both of them breathing hard. "I'm going to keep you alive," he said, the ice entirely gone. "But I am never going to keep you invisible again. After tonight, the whole world knows exactly what you are to me. It's more dangerous that way. I don't care." His hands tightened. "I am done pretending you don't own me. You've been running my flank for 3 years. Come run it, standing next to me, where I can see you." Was that a promotion? It was a proposal of a kind of partnership I don't have a clean word for yet. Bella almost laughed through the tears. We'll work on the word. They cornered Luca Ferraro in the parking structure. 11 minutes later, Damon's men had sealed the exits before the screaming upstairs had peaked, and the killer trapped on the third level in the concrete half-light had done what trapped professionals do, which was go very still and very calm and wait to see what kind of man had caught him. Damon walked in with Bella's hand in his, because tonight he was simply not capable of putting her anywhere he couldn't see her, and Luca looked at their joined hands and understood, without a word, the exact shape of his own failure. Damon did not ask him who sent him. Damon did not need to ask. He'd spent the 11-minute walk down assembling it, the way he assembled everything, and he laid it out now not as a question but as a fact, watching Ferraro's face for the single flicker that would confirm it. You're not Ferraro's investor, Damon said quietly. You're their answer to a problem. They can't reach me too many walls, too much money, too many loyal men. So they spent 6 months looking for the one thing I'd guard badly because I'd never admit it mattered. His eyes were flat grey water, and they found her. The assistant I keep dressed like she's nobody. Get close to her. Get close to me. Elegant. A pause. The only thing you didn't account for is that she's been watching you longer than you've been watching her. Luca said nothing. He only smiled, a slow, tired, contemptuous smile, and let his gaze drift, deliberately, from Damon's face to Bella's, and back. He did not brag. He did not explain. He simply held Damon's eyes and said, in a voice like a man laying down a card he knows will win, ask yourself who told us where to look. And then he said nothing more, because a professional's last weapon is a door left open in another man's mind. The smile stayed on his face right up until Damon nodded once that small movement, almost nothing, and his men stepped forward, and Bella turned her face into Damon's shoulder. Not from squeamishness, but because she'd already gotten what she needed from Luca Ferraro and had no use for the rest. Ask yourself who told us where to look. Damon walked her out of the parking structure into the warm Miami night, palms black against a purple sky, and he was quiet for a long time. Bella let him be. She was doing arithmetic of her own. 6 months, she said finally, softly. The Ferraros couldn't get near you, but someone told them exactly where your one soft spot was. Someone who knew before you'd even admitted it to yourself that I was it. She looked up at him. Someone close enough to see what you couldn't. Damon's jaw was stone. You're thinking what I'm thinking. I'm thinking your mother sent me that dress tonight. Bella watched his face. There was a note on the back of her card, Damon. Not in your handwriting. It said, let them see you. It's time he stopped being a coward. She let that settle. She forced you into the open tonight, right when the Ferraros had a shooter in the room. That's either the worst timing in the world, or she knew, Damon said, very low, exactly what would happen. And she wanted it to. They stood in the warm dark, and the thing between them shifted into something larger and colder and more interesting than a single killer in a parking garage. Your mother's been running more than Sunday lunch, Bella said. For years, Damon murmured, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard the sound of a man realizing the person he trusted most might be the board and not a player on it. The question is whether she fed me to Ferraro to get me killed, or whether she fed Ferraro to me, dangled you as bait. She knew my jealousy would guard to force me to finally act, to smoke out the traitor, to make me choose you in front of the whole city so no one could ever use the secret against me again. He exhaled slowly. With my mother, it's always both. She never makes one move that does one thing. Bella slid her hand back into his. Then, I think, she said carefully, you and I need to go have Sunday lunch. Damon looked down at her, this woman he'd kept plain and kept close, and never once let himself see, who had saved his life tonight and outthought his enemies and was now, calmly, proposing they walk together into the one room in his world he'd never dared examine. And for the first time in 11 years, Damon Ricci felt something that was not fear of feeling. He felt matched. Together, he said. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. Together, Bella said. I don't do flanks alone anymore. Neither do you. 6 weeks later, Bella stood on the balcony of the Brickell penthouse in the gold of early morning, wearing one of Damon's shirts and nothing plain about her at all, watching the city wake. Everything was different. The whole world knew now the way he'd promised. and Miami had rearranged itself around the fact that Bella Moreno was no longer the invisible woman behind the desk, but the woman Damon Ricci had shielded with his body in front of 200 witnesses. It should have frightened her more than it did, but she wasn't the woman who hid in the safe corner of the room anymore. She'd found out she was better at the front of it. The Ferraros had gone quiet. Damon and Bella both understood now to read carefully because they had spent 4 of the last 6 Sundays at a certain lunch table, learning the exact dimensions of the game Isabella Ricci had been playing for a decade. The old woman had admitted nothing and revealed everything. In that way she had. She had looked at Bella over the rim of a wine glass on the second Sunday and said only, "You wore the green. Good. I was beginning to think you'd let him waste you both." And Bella had understood that she was being welcomed and evaluated and warned all at once. She was learning that game now, the way she'd learned every other one, by watching, by paying attention, by making herself indispensable in a way no one could see until it was far too late to remove her. Damon watched her do it and did not try to stop her. He'd stopped entirely, wanting to keep her out of anything. She heard him behind her before she felt him. The man moved like weather, and then his arms came around her from behind and his chin settled against her hair. "You're not wearing the emerald," he murmured. "It's 8 in the morning." She felt him smile against her hair, the smile he'd spent a decade forgetting how to make. "There's a dinner tonight. Your mother-in-law's shaped problem will be there. Wear it. So she can see her plan worked." "So she can see," Damon said, "that it worked better than she planned. That's the only move left that surprises her. Let her look at us and understand she built something she can't take apart." His arms tightened, "And let the whole room look at you." Bella turned in his arms to look up at him, this dangerous, thawing, ruined, and remade man who'd spent 3 years hiding her and would spend the rest of his life refusing to. "And you're fine now? With everyone looking?" Damon considered it with total seriousness, the way he considered everything that mattered. "No," he said finally, and there was the ghost of the old growl in it, the possessive dark thing he no longer had any reason to bury. "I want them all to look at me first, and then to look at you, and then to understand, for the rest of their lives, exactly what you are, not something I own, something I was smart enough, once, to finally stop overlooking." His voice dropped. "The only good decision I ever made was the day I stopped underestimating you. Everything before that was just me, wasting us both." Bella smiled, the real one, the one she used to hide. "That's a much better line than 'no one looks at what's mine.'" "I'm a work in progress," Damon said. "I have an excellent teacher." He kissed her, unhurried, a man with nothing left to hide and everything left to build, no longer beside a woman he was guarding, but a woman guarding the same walls from the same side. Out over the water, the sun cleared the horizon and turned the whole sea to fire, and Bella closed her eyes and let the most feared man in Miami hold her in the light he'd spent 3 years keeping her out of. Somewhere across the city, an old woman with a glass of morning wine looked at a photograph of the two of them leaving the club, his coat on her shoulders, her hand already reaching to steady him, and smiled to herself, and made a note in a small private book of her own. "The board," Isabella Ricci wrote, "has a new player. Good, it was getting dull. And the game, which was so much larger than one club and one dress and one killer in a parking garage, went quietly on." He spent 3 years keeping her out of the light, certain the shadows were the only place she'd be safe. And in the end, it was the light she chose herself that made her impossible to overlook and impossible to lose. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen by the one person who refuses to look, and some people, like Bella, finally decide that being safe was never the same as being alive. If Damon and Bella earned a place in your heart tonight, leave a like so this story finds the next person who needs to hear it, and subscribe to stay close for the ones still coming. Share it with someone who's ever felt invisible in a crowded room. And tell me, if being seen meant being in danger, would you still choose to step into the light or stay safely in the dark? The end.